One leaky valve ignited a chain reaction that unleashed an inferno at the Phillips chemical plant. This disaster would shed light on the dangers of lax safety regulations, expose a corporate culture that treated worker deaths as acceptable business costs, and reveal how a company could ignore its own internal warnings about deadly design flaws because fixing them would hurt quarterly profits. October 23, 1989, 1:03 p.m. Pasadena, Texas. The smell hit you first at the Phillips Petroleum Company's Houston chemical complex, that sharp chemical tang that burned the back of your throat and never quite left your clothes no matter how many times you washed them. Workers joked that their wives could tell when they'd had a bad day just by how strongly they reeked when they walked through the door. It was the smell of money, the smell of progress, the smell of the petrochemical industry that had transformed the swampy coastline along the Buffalo Bayou into one of the most industrialized corridors in America. In the break room of Plant 5, a group of contractors sat around plastic tables finishing their lunches. Most were young men in their 20s and 30s, guys who'd taken these jobs because they paid decent money for dangerous work. Not great money, mind you, but enough to make car payments, support families, maybe save a little for the future. They wore the uniform of their trade, hard hats marked with their subcontractor company logos, steel-toed boots scuffed from years of climbing metal scaffolding, flame-resistant coveralls that were supposed to protect them from the hazards they faced every day in one of America's most dangerous industries. Tommy Roach, 24 years old, was telling a joke about his mother-in-law when the first alarm sounded. He'd been working at the Phillips plant for 8 months as a contractor for a maintenance company long enough to know the difference between a test alarm and the real thing. This one had that urgency to it, that piercing, unrelenting wail that meant something had gone seriously wrong. The laughter died in mid-sentence. Roach and his crew looked at each other with the kind of recognition that comes from working in an environment where seriously wrong could mean anything from a small leak to a catastrophic explosion. What the hell is that? Someone asked, but nobody answered because they were already moving, pushing back from tables, heading toward the exit. Training kicked in. Get to your assembly point, wait for instructions, don't panic. But then came the second sound, the one that turned concern into raw terror, a deafening hiss, like a jet engine screaming at full throttle coming from somewhere near Reactor 6. Tommy Roach would never make it out of Plant 5. Neither would 22 other workers who were in the wrong place at the wrong moment when 85,000 pounds of superheated chemicals erupted into the atmosphere and transformed an ordinary Monday afternoon into the deadliest chemical disaster in American industrial history. But to understand how a routine maintenance job could kill 23 people in under 3 minutes, you have to understand the Phillips Houston chemical complex itself, what it was, how it operated, and most importantly the corporate culture that made disaster not just possible but inevitable. The facility sprawled across hundreds of acres along the industrial coastline south of Houston, a maze of steel towers, pressurized vessels, and miles of piping that operated 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. From a distance, especially at night when thousands of safety lights illuminated the complex, it looked almost beautiful, a cathedral of industry, a monument to human ingenuity and technological progress. Up close, it was something else entirely, a place where volatile chemicals were heated to extreme temperatures, compressed under pressures that could turn steel into shrapnel, and processed by workers who understood that every valve, every gauge, every procedure existed to keep them from being killed by the substances they worked with daily. Phillips Petroleum Company's public image emphasized safety above all else. Their annual reports featured photographs of workers in pristine facilities, accompanied by paragraphs praising the company's unwavering commitment to operational excellence and employee welfare. They published safety statistics showing declining incident rates. They distributed glossy brochures to local communities assuring residents that the plant operated under the strictest safety protocols in the industry. Company executives gave speeches at industry conferences about Phillips' leadership in process safety management. The reality on the ground told a different story, one written in incident reports that never made it into annual reports, whispered in break rooms where workers compared near-miss stories, and buried in internal memos that called for immediate corrective action but somehow never translated into actual changes. Workers knew, the way people know things they're not supposed to talk about openly, that corners were being cut, that safety measures were being treated as suggestions rather than requirements, and that the company's real priority wasn't keeping them safe but keeping production running and costs down. The two-tier employment system crystallized this reality in ways that made it impossible to ignore. Regular Phillips employees, the ones with union protection, good salaries, full benefits and job security, worked alongside contractors who earned roughly 65% as much for doing identical work. The contractors received no medical insurance, no pension contributions, no paid vacation, no sick leave. If they got injured, they relied on workers' compensation insurance that their subcontracting company provided, assuming that company had adequate coverage and wouldn't fight every claim to minimize payouts. But the wage gap and benefit disparity were just symptoms of a deeper problem. Contractors existed in a fundamentally different relationship to workplace safety than regular employees. If a regular employee raised concerns about a dangerous procedure, they had union representation and legal protections. If a contractor raised the same concerns, they could be dismissed immediately and blacklisted from future work. If a regular employee refused to perform a task they considered unsafe, they had recourse through grievance procedures. If a contractor refused, they were replaced by someone hungrier, someone more willing to accept risk in exchange for a paycheck. This created a system where the people facing the greatest dangers, the contractors doing hands-on maintenance and operations work, had the least ability to protect themselves and the least incentive to report problems. Everyone understood this dynamic without it ever being stated explicitly. It was just how things worked in the petrochemical industry of the 1980s. Part of the background reality that workers accepted because questioning it meant losing your job. At the center of October 23rd's nightmare stood Reactor 6, a 150-foot tall pressure vessel that produced high-density polyethylene through a carefully orchestrated chemical process. Inside the reactor, a mixture of ethylene, isobutane, hydrogen and hexene was heated to 230 degrees Fahrenheit under pressure of 600 pounds per square inch, about 40 times the pressure in a car tire, enough to turn a small leak into a devastating rupture. Under these extreme conditions, the chemicals bonded to form HDPE particles that would eventually become plastic bottles, containers, and countless consumer products. The HDPE particles settled into 6 pipes called settling legs, which transported the finished product to storage tanks for further processing. But like arteries gradually accumulating plaque, these pipes would slowly clog with plastic buildup that had to be cleared manually. The unclogging procedure was routine, something that happened regularly, that workers had performed hundreds of times without incident. On paper, it seemed straightforward enough. Close an isolation valve to separate the settling leg from the reactor. Verify the valve indicator reads closed. Disconnect 2 air hoses that controlled the valve's operation. Install a physical lock, chain and padlock to ensure the valve couldn't accidentally open during maintenance. Only then, with the settling leg completely isolated from the pressurized reactor, open a second valve at the bottom and remove the accumulated plastic. The procedure had been designed with multiple layers of safety in mind. The isolation valve was the primary barrier. The valve position indicator provided verification. The physical lock served as a backup in case someone accidentally tried to operate the valve. Each layer was supposed to catch any failures in the previous layer, creating a system where a single mistake wouldn't lead to catastrophe. That was the theory, anyway. On Sunday, October 21, 1989, 48 hours before the disaster, all 6 of Reactor 6's settling legs had become clogged simultaneously, triggering the maintenance protocol. The day shift crew began the unclogging procedure on settling leg number 4. They followed the steps as documented, closed the isolation valve, checked the indicator which read closed, disconnected the 2 air hoses from the valve actuator, and installed the physical lock. Everything appeared secure. The settling leg was isolated, or so everyone believed. Then came the decision that set everything in motion. The final step, opening the bottom valve and clearing the plastic buildup, was postponed until Monday. Other priorities had emerged, other tasks demanded attention, production schedules were tight. Management made a judgment call: the partially completed maintenance could wait. The physical lock was in place. The valve indicator showed closed. What could go wrong? It was exactly the kind of decision that gets made thousands of times in industrial facilities without consequence, the kind of calculated risk that seems reasonable when you're balancing competing priorities and trying to keep production running. Nobody asked what would happen if information didn't transfer cleanly between shifts. Nobody considered what might occur if the next crew didn't fully understand what had been left undone. Nobody thought about the workers who would arrive Monday morning to finish a job they hadn't started, working with equipment they might not be entirely familiar with, following procedures that might not be completely clear. The reactor hummed through the weekend, continuing to produce HDPE, continuing to make money, while settling leg number 4 sat locked but not fully serviced, a time bomb that just needed the right combination of circumstances to detonate. Monday morning arrived with picture-perfect weather, clear skies, mild temperatures, the kind of day that made Houston's brutal summers seem worth enduring. Workers clocked in for the day shift, including a maintenance crew of contractors assigned to complete the work on Reactor 6's settling legs. These men represented the bottom tier of the Phillips employment hierarchy. They worked for subcontracting companies that Phillips hired to handle maintenance and operations tasks, a business arrangement that had become increasingly common throughout the petrochemical industry during the cost-cutting fervor of the 1980s. The crew that morning included men like Tommy Roach, the 24-year-old who'd been joking about his mother-in-law minutes before the alarm sounded. Men like Randy Davis, 31, who'd worked in chemical plants since graduating high school and knew the work was dangerous but figured the odds were on his side. Men like James Warner, 28, whose wife had begged him to find a safer job, but who stayed because the money was better than anything else he could get with just a high school diploma. These were the men assigned to finish the maintenance on settling leg number 4, to complete the procedure that the previous crew had started 2 days earlier. Someone and investigators would never definitively determine who removed the physical lock from the isolation valve. This was necessary to complete the maintenance, to open the bottom valve and clear the plastic buildup. But removing that lock eliminated the last physical barrier protecting them from the pressurized reactor. Everything now depended on the isolation valve remaining closed. Everything depended on those 2 air hoses being connected correctly. Here's where the design flaw that Phillips had been explicitly warned about, documented in internal memos, flagged by safety inspectors, identified in previous incident investigations, became lethal. The air supply hose and the air discharge hose for the valve actuator were identical. Same size, same color, same threading, same everything. There was no foolproof mechanism to prevent them from being attached in reverse, no color coding, no different connector types. No engineering solution to make incorrect assembly physically impossible. An experienced operator who worked with this specific valve regularly, who had muscle memory built up from hundreds of repetitions, might automatically connect the hoses correctly. A contractor assigned to this equipment for the first time, working from written procedures that may or may not have clearly specified which hose went where, had no way to be certain. They had a 50-50 chance of guessing correctly. Russian roulette with air hoses, when those air hoses were reconnected in reverse, and OSHA investigators would later conclude with mere certainty that this is what happened, the entire safety system collapsed. The valve position indicator still showed closed because the indicator was measuring air pressure in the actuator, not the actual position of the valve itself, but the valve was open. Completely open. And Reactor 6, still operating at 230 degrees Fahrenheit and 600 psi, now had a direct, unobstructed path to the outside world through settling leg number 4. At 1:05 p.m., the reactor's entire contents, 85,000 pounds of superheated, highly flammable chemicals under immense pressure, erupted through the settling leg in a violent release that lasted less than 60 seconds. The sound was described by survivors as like a jet engine exploding, a screaming roar that made your bones vibrate, the sound of the world ending. The chemicals didn't immediately ignite, which would have been catastrophic enough. Instead, they formed a vapor cloud, an invisible fog of death that spread rapidly across Plant 5, flowing around buildings and equipment, growing larger with each passing second. This cloud was heavier than air, hugging the ground as it expanded, driven by its own pressure and the gentle breeze that had made the morning feel so pleasant. Everyone who saw it, though saw isn't quite right, because the cloud was largely invisible, more a shimmer in the air, a distortion like heat rising from pavement, understood immediately what it meant. They were standing inside a massive bomb. The only question was how long they had before it found an ignition source. The warning alarms finally activated, piercing, urgent, the kind of sound designed to trigger immediate flight response. But for many workers the alarms came too late. They'd already been inside the vapor cloud for precious seconds, breathing in chemicals that would damage their lungs even if they somehow survived what came next. Tommy Roach and his crew in the break room heard the alarms and started moving, but they had no way of knowing they were already dead men, that the cloud had enveloped their building, that escape was mathematically impossible given the distance to the perimeter fence and the speed at which the vapor was spreading. Some workers closer to the plant's edge made split-second decisions that saved their lives. Marcus Williams, a 32-year-old Phillips employee operating a control board 400 feet from Reactor 6, saw the shimmer in the air through his window and immediately understood what was happening. He didn't wait for official evacuation orders. He didn't stop to shut down his equipment properly. He ran. He hit the emergency exit door at full speed, kept running across the parking lot, threw himself over the perimeter fence, and kept running across an open field. He would later describe feeling like he was moving in slow motion, like in nightmares where your legs won't work right, and something terrible is chasing you. He could hear other workers running behind him, could hear the screaming, could hear the hissing roar of the chemical release that seemed to be getting louder, closer, as if the cloud itself was chasing them. Michael Torres, a contractor who'd been working on scaffolding near Reactor 6, had an even closer call. He saw the release happen from maybe 100 feet away, saw the settling leg literally vomit chemicals into the air with such force that it created a visible mist around the point of release. Torres didn't think. Thinking would have meant death. He jumped from the scaffolding, a 15-foot drop that sprained his ankle badly, and limped ran toward the fence line. Other workers were running too, all heading in the same direction like a school of fish fleeing a predator, operating on pure survival instinct. Torres described looking back once, just once, couldn't help himself, and seeing the vapor cloud spreading like a living thing, flowing around obstacles, filling every space, growing impossibly fast. That image would haunt his nightmares for the rest of his life. The vapor cloud drifted for approximately 90 to 120 seconds, somewhere between a minute and a half and 2 minutes, though survivors would give wildly different estimates, because time loses meaning when you're running for your life. Every second felt like an eternity. Every step felt like you were running through mud. Your brain kept screaming that you weren't moving fast enough, that the cloud was overtaking you, that the explosion was coming now, no now, except it didn't come, not yet, and that made the terror worse, because you knew it was coming, it was inevitable, you just didn't know when. Then it found its ignition source. Investigators would never definitively determine what provided the spark that ignited 85,000 pounds of flammable vapor. In a chemical plant filled with hot surfaces, electrical equipment, running engines, and countless other potential ignition sources, pinpointing the exact cause was like asking which specific match started a forest fire. It could have been a hot bearing in a pump. Could have been a spark from an electrical motor. Could have been exhaust from a truck. Could have been a static discharge. In the end, it didn't matter. The cloud found its spark, and chemistry did what chemistry does when you mix fuel and oxygen and ignition in the right proportions. The explosion registered 3.5 on the Richter scale. Seismologists at monitoring stations around Houston recorded what they initially interpreted as a minor earthquake, unusual for the area, but not unheard of. They had no idea they were measuring an industrial catastrophe that would kill 23 people and injure 130 more. The blast was equivalent to 2.4 tons of TNT detonating simultaneously across Plant 5, releasing energy in a shockwave that traveled faster than sound, faster than anything human reflexes could react to. Marcus Williams, the control board operator who'd been running across the field outside the plant, felt the shockwave hit him from behind like an invisible wall. It knocked him off his feet and threw him forward, maybe 30 feet, sent him tumbling across the grass with his ears ringing and his vision going white. He described the sensation of being inside the explosion, not at the center, but close enough, as like being hit by a car, except the car was made of air, and it hit every part of your body simultaneously. He landed hard, couldn't breathe for several seconds, thought maybe his lungs had been crushed, then his vision cleared enough to look back toward the plant, and what he saw made him forget about his injuries entirely. Plant 5 was gone. Not damaged, not on fire, gone. Where buildings and equipment had stood just seconds before, there was now a roiling ball of fire and smoke, debris still flying through the air in all directions, chunks of metal the size of cars tumbling end over end like leaves in a hurricane. The blast wave had essentially disintegrated everything within 250 feet of Reactor 6. Buildings were reduced to twisted metal frames, vehicles were overturned and burning, equipment that had weighed tons was simply erased, vaporized by the force of the explosion, or blown into fragments too small to recognize. Michael Torres, the contractor who'd sprained his ankle jumping from scaffolding, had made it about 200 feet from the reactor when the explosion occurred. The blast wave picked him up and threw him like a rag doll. He hit something, a fence post he thought later, though he couldn't be sure, and felt ribs crack. He landed in a drainage ditch filled with oily water, and couldn't move for several seconds, just lay there gasping, his body refusing to obey his brain's commands. When he finally managed to lift his head and look around, he saw people on fire. Not their clothes, not something they were carrying, they themselves were on fire, human torches stumbling and screaming. Torres tried to get up to help them, but his legs wouldn't work right. He crawled a few feet, and then just stopped, overwhelmed by pain and shock, watching the nightmare unfold around him, while his brain kept insisting this couldn't be real, couldn't be happening. The workers who'd been inside the break room with Tommy Roach never stood a chance. The building was within the primary blast radius. The explosion didn't just knock it down, it essentially atomized it, turned concrete and steel into shrapnel that became secondary projectiles, adding to the devastation. Of the 23 workers who would die that day, most were in or near that break room. When the vapor cloud ignited, the force of the blast killed them instantly, though instantly might be too kind a word, might suggest a painless transition. The reality was more brutal. Bodies subjected to pressure waves that ruptured organs, temperatures that seared lungs, shock waves that literally tore flesh from bone. Tommy Roach's body would be identified later by his wedding ring and dental records. There wasn't enough left of him for his wife to view, a small mercy that the funeral director emphasized when he strongly recommended a closed casket. His mother would insist on seeing him anyway, would push past the funeral director's objections, and would spend the rest of her life wishing she'd listened. Some things, once seen, can never be unseen. But the initial explosion was only the beginning of the disaster cascade. The blast set most of Plant 5 ablaze within seconds. Fire consumed everything combustible: buildings, vehicles, plastics, chemicals, decades of accumulated industrial materials. The heat was so intense that steel beams began to glow red and then white, softening and twisting under their own weight. Aluminum structures simply melted, creating rivers of molten metal that flowed across the ground. Paint vaporized off surfaces hundreds of feet from the flame's center. The air itself seemed to be burning, superheated to temperatures that could kill you just by breathing. 10 to 15 minutes after the initial explosion, witnesses would give varying accounts of the exact timing, because when you're watching your workplace burn, and wondering if you're about to die, precise chronology becomes difficult. The flames reached 2 massive isobutane storage tanks. Each tank held 20,000 gallons of one of the most flammable chemicals in the plant. When isobutane is heated beyond its boiling point, while still contained under pressure, it doesn't just burn, it explodes with a violence that makes the first blast seem almost gentle by comparison. The secondary explosion, when those tanks failed, was powerful enough to register on seismographs again. A second earthquake reading that finally made the monitoring stations realize something catastrophic was happening in Pasadena. The blast sent a fireball hundreds of feet into the air, visible from downtown Houston 25 miles away. More debris filled the sky. Twisted metal, burning chemical residue, fragments of tanks and pipes that had been designed to contain 600 psi, but couldn't survive the inferno. Workers who had survived the first explosion and were trying to help with evacuations or render aid to the injured now found themselves running for their lives again, diving behind whatever cover they could find as shrapnel rained down. 25 to 45 minutes into the disaster, again the exact timing remained disputed, another polyethylene reactor failed catastrophically. Investigators would debate whether this constituted a third major explosion or was simply a continuation of the cascading failures triggered by the initial blast. The distinction mattered for technical reports but meant nothing to the people on the ground, who just knew that another massive boom had shaken the complex, that more flames had erupted, that the nightmare kept getting worse just when you thought it might be stabilizing. Witnesses reported possibly 3 more significant explosions over the following hours as the fire found new fuel sources, as pressurized vessels failed from heat exposure, as the domino effect of destruction continued propagating through the interconnected facility. But by this point, chaos had overwhelmed any ability to maintain accurate counts. People were running, screaming, trying to find co-workers, trying to help the injured, trying to comprehend the scale of what was happening. The first professional responders were members of the Phillips Company Fire Brigade, plant employees specifically trained for emergency response. They'd been at their station when the explosion occurred, had felt the building shake, had seen the smoke rising and had immediately mobilized. But as their fire truck approached Plant 5, they confronted a scene that their training had prepared them for intellectually but not emotionally. The entire plant was engulfed in flames that reached 200 feet high. Multiple secondary fires burned throughout the complex. Workers were stumbling out of the smoke, many of them injured, some of them on fire, and worst of all, the explosion had destroyed significant portions of the plant's firefighting water distribution system, the very infrastructure they needed to combat the blaze. The irony was almost too bitter to process. The plant had extensive firefighting equipment, hydrants, sprinkler systems, foam dispensers, water mains capable of delivering thousands of gallons per minute, but the explosion had ruptured pipes, destroyed pumps, and severed connections. When firefighters attached hoses to hydrants, they got trickles instead of torrents. When they tried to activate foam systems, nothing happened because the control lines were cut. They had access to unlimited firefighting equipment that no longer worked because the disaster they needed to fight had destroyed the tools they needed to fight it. Firefighters from the Channel Industries Mutual Aid Association, a cooperative formed by chemical plants along the Houston Ship Channel specifically for disasters of this magnitude, arrived within 20 minutes of the initial explosion. They brought additional equipment, additional personnel, and most critically, additional water sources. But even with reinforcements, the situation was overwhelming. The fire's intensity and the massive fuel load made traditional firefighting approaches nearly useless. You couldn't get close enough to spray water effectively without the heat driving you back. Foam application required proximity that would kill you. The best they could do was try to contain the blaze, prevent it from spreading to other sections of the complex, and keep surrounding tanks and vessels cool enough that they wouldn't rupture and create new catastrophes. They improvised desperately and creatively. Drew water from a cooling tower that had somehow survived the blast, ran hoses to a water main from a neighboring plant a quarter-mile away, pumped from settling ponds filled with stagnant oily water that wasn't ideal but was wet, and that was what mattered. Even drew water directly from the Houston Ship Channel, that industrial waterway running alongside the complex, deploying fireboats to spray from the water side. But despite these heroic efforts and creative problem-solving, the fire's sheer scale and intensity overwhelmed their capabilities. All they could really do was protect exposures, keep the fire from spreading and wait for it to burn itself out. The fire burned for 10 hours. 10 hours of flames reaching hundreds of feet into the air, of smoke visible from 50 miles away, of heat so intense that firefighters 100 feet from the blaze had to wear full protective gear, and still could only work in 10-minute rotations before heat exhaustion forced them to retreat. 10 hours of wondering if there were survivors trapped in the wreckage, if someone was calling for help but couldn't be heard over the roar of flames, if you were letting people die because you couldn't get close enough to save them. 10 hours of watching millions of dollars of equipment burn, of knowing that somewhere in that inferno were bodies, of understanding that some of those bodies would never be recovered because the fire would simply erase them. Marcus Williams, the control operator who'd been thrown 30 feet by the blast, sat in an ambulance getting his injuries checked and watched the fire burn. He'd suffered a concussion, multiple contusions and temporary hearing loss that would mostly but not entirely resolve over the following weeks. The paramedics wanted to transport him to the hospital, but he refused to leave until he knew which of his co-workers had made it out. Someone had set up an informal accountability check at a safe distance from the fire, just a clipboard and a list of names with people checking off who they'd seen escape. Williams scanned the list with growing horror, saw name after name without checkmarks, recognized some of them as friends he'd worked with for years, as guys he'd had lunch with just hours before, as people who'd been real and alive and were now probably dead in the fire. "Where's Tommy?" someone asked, referring to Tommy Roach, the 24-year-old contractor. "Has anyone seen Tommy?" Nobody had, nobody would. Tommy was gone, along with Randy Davis and James Warner, and 20 other men whose last moments had been spent in terror and agony as they tried to escape an explosion that moved faster than human reflexes could react to. By late afternoon, the fire was officially under control in the sense that it was no longer spreading, no longer threatening other sections of the complex, but hotspots continued to smolder, flaring up unpredictably. Structural collapses remained a constant danger as heat-weakened metal finally gave way. Toxic chemicals had contaminated everything, creating hazards even in areas that hadn't burned. Only the following morning, nearly 24 hours after the initial explosion, did officials declare the site safe enough for recovery operations to begin. Among the first to enter the ruins were officers from the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, the federal agency responsible for workplace safety. While others focused on recovering bodies and searching for any unlikely survivors, OSHA investigators began the meticulous work of documenting evidence, photographing equipment, collecting samples, interviewing witnesses. They knew from experience that memories fade, that evidence gets contaminated or destroyed, that the first 24 to 48 hours after a disaster are crucial for establishing what actually happened before corporate lawyers and public relations teams can start shaping narratives. What they found shocked even investigators who'd spent careers examining industrial accidents. The disaster wasn't an unforeseeable accident, wasn't an act of God, wasn't the result of some bizarre combination of coincidences that nobody could have predicted. It was the utterly predictable result of known hazards that Phillips had been explicitly warned about, and had consciously chosen to ignore because fixing them would cost money and reduce production efficiency. The identical air hoses that could be connected backward, known issue. Documented in internal safety audits, flagged by contractors who'd pointed out the design flaw, recommendations made to install color-coded hoses, or different connector types that would make incorrect assembly physically impossible. Cost estimate, roughly $500 per valve, maybe $50,000 total for the entire plant. Management response deferred for budget considerations, translation not worth spending money on. The fact that this decision would eventually cost 23 lives and $715 million in property damage, plus another $700 million in lost production, apparently didn't factor into the cost-benefit analysis. The lack of backup safety systems. Another known issue with an even more damning paper trail. Industry standard practice required multiple redundant safety measures. If one fails, another catches the problem before catastrophe occurs. Phillips had deliberately stripped away those redundancies in the name of operational efficiency. Internal memos used phrases like streamlining maintenance procedures and reducing unnecessary redundancy, bureaucratic euphemisms for removing safety measures that slowed down operations and cost money to maintain. The memos included acknowledgments that this increased risk, but the increased risk was deemed acceptable given the cost savings. Perhaps most damning was the discovery that Phillips had experienced a remarkably similar incident just 2 months earlier, in August 1989. Subcontractors had opened piping to a tank without properly isolating the line, allowing flammable solvents to vent into an adjacent work area. The solvents immediately ignited from an unknown ignition source. 4 workers were burned, 2 of them fatally. An investigation was conducted, a report was written. Recommendations were made, including specific corrective actions to prevent similar incidents. Those recommendations were reviewed by management, marked as under consideration, and then effectively filed away and forgotten. No changes were made, no procedures were updated, no additional training was provided. The 2 deaths were treated as an unfortunate accident, rather than a warning sign of systemic problems.